I see spots, but that's just, you know.
Okay, Lynn, we're recording. You can begin when you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those folks out in the West Coast. My name is Len Statham. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for NIAPRS, and I'm very thrilled that NIAPRS is offering another webinar. And this week, it's Standing on the Shoulders, Stories of Our Movement. And I will leave the introductions to Harvey. Just want to go through just a couple slides before we begin. Next slide, Ruth. For those of you who are not familiar with NIAPRS, this is probably no one, but I'm just going to make sure that for those 2 or 3 people out there that might not be familiar with NIAPRS and you're joining us for the first time, we are a change agent dedicated to improving services, public policies, and social conditions for people with mental health, substance use, and trauma-related challenges. And we do this by promoting health and wellness and recovery with full community inclusion, so that everyone can achieve their maximum potential in the communities that they choose. And we're doing that partly during COVID through our webinar formats, which have been extremely well received. We've had 600-700 people on every webinar, so we're thrilled that you're here today. Also, NIAPRS is offering every single day a mindful moment, and it is done by Ruth Cologne Wagner, who is our Director of Training at NIAPRS, and it is a wonderful way to start your day. All you have to do is click on to the www.niaprs.org. Every morning, 8 o'clock, there's a new mindfulness exercise. It's about 5 minutes. It doesn't take long, but that's 5 minutes well invested. So I encourage you to do that. Also, we are in the middle of a Strive for 5 challenge. Our partners, we're partnering with the Behavioral Health Coalition in New York City, and we're just helping people, New Yorkers in particular, because it's a Strive for 5 for New Yorkers, to look out for each other and do some things that will help other people stay well during this time. We're identifying 5 people that, and we encourage you to identify 5 people that you can reach out to. Think about those folks that may be in recovery or might be isolated and that you want to get to and encourage every single day. And if you're wanting to take the Strive for 5 challenge, encourage you to give us an email at strivefor5challenge@gmail.com and let us know that you're going to participate. I also mentioned the webinars. We have more great webinars coming up in August. One is a cultural competency and a nation in crisis, dealing with the effects of racism and sexism in our practice during COVID. A timely webinar. We have another one on August 12th, which is strategy in an uncertain world. That's for organizations that are looking to sort of move a little bit further post-COVID. And then finally, facing the challenge of returning to normal, creative and nimble leadership might be the answer. So we're hoping that you join us for those webinars as well. And I'd like to just do some very quick housekeeping, and then I'll get out of people's way and let you see the folks and listen to their wisdom. So today's webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to find the recording and the PowerPoint, which will be posted on our website at www.niaprs.org. And we're also providing CEUs for licensed social workers, CPRPs, and licensed mental health counselors. In order to receive the CEs, though, you have to be virtually in the room and not on the phone. And then complete and return an evaluation that'll come right after we finish this webinar within 48 hours. We will not be able to provide any webinar participants with CEs if they haven't completed that evaluation. It's just part of not our policy, but all the different organizations. And then finally, please keep your phones on mute and your cameras turned off so that we can view our great guests today, and we'll be able to hear them as well. My pleasure to introduce our CEO and great mentor, great friend, great leader, Harvey Rosenthal. Harvey?
Len, thank you so much, Len. It's such a pleasure having you in the role you are. You're a great partner and doing wonderful things together. You able to hear me okay? Is my phone loud enough? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes, you sound
So
fine.
I want to thank Ruth, and I want to thank Len and Eileen from our staff for helping to put this together. We are going to be collecting, maybe Len said this, we are going to be collecting. I'm going to talk directly into the phone. My computers, the speakers are on, not working, so I'm going to have to use the phone. So I just want to say, you know, we've done a lot of webinars since COVID, probably one a week. And there's been on topics, but this is my favorite one. These folks that we're going to be meeting and talking to and having a conversation. This is not a PowerPoint discussion. This is 4 folks sitting around and sharing some memories and some thoughts and some hopes. And we really, I'm looking so much. I see, Len, a number of people are saying they're on mute. If there's anything we can help them, that would be great. They're supposed to be on mute, actually. Actually, let me jump in there and say that everybody is going to be on mute. You are going to use the chat box, and Len is going to take your questions and collect them and give them back. But these folks are responsible for so much that we take for granted now and we experience. We were talking before the webinar and reminiscing as older people about fax machines when they were the only option, and you couldn't cut and paste and no email. That's how old we are. So we really, you know, these folks really go back and are responsible for so much. So we've talked a little bit by email about what we're going to talk about. And again, we're going to be very casual and conversational. I am going to read a couple of introductory comments about them and tell you about them right now. I'm going to put my phone back to my mouth, so don't worry. Okay. Okay, Joseph Rogers is the founder and executive director of the National Mental Health Consumer Self-Help Clearinghouse, the first peer-run national TA center in the country. From 97 to 07, he was president and CEO of the Mental Health Association of Southeast Pennsylvania, which he grew from a very small agency into one of the largest MHAs in the country, a real leader and exemplar in the MHAs. Among his numerous accomplishments, he helped to facilitate the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we just celebrated the 30th anniversary. He served on the Congressional Task Force on the Rights and Empowerment of Americans with Disabilities. He consulted on behavioral health issues he has in 30 states or more, as well as with the federal government internationally. He has testified before numerous legislative bodies, Committee of the Senate, Pennsylvania General Assembly, Philadelphia City Council. He's a national leader of the movement for social justice of people with mental health diagnosis. He has received, you know, whether it's the Heinz Award for the Human Condition, Samson's Voice Award. And Joseph has just been amazing. I remember meeting him at Alternative some years ago. The TA Center he set up really brought people together, brought the movement together in many instances. And I've always admired his very pragmatic approach. Susan Rogers, thank you, Susan, for your help today. Anna Casper told me to say that. But Susan reminded me, Joe is a pragmatist with ideals, or he's an idealist who's pragmatic, and I couldn't say it better. He's accomplished so much by being a real strategist who always stays on message and from the heart and with values. Sally Zinman is another pioneer of the mental health peer movement since the mid-70s. Her commitment to the rights of people with mental health challenges came from her own horrendous experience in the mental health system. After this experience, she connected with the burgeoning ex-mental patient movement and founded a community of people like herself, a family who has inspired and supported her for the next 40 years. Sally founded some of the earliest consumer run drop-in centers in the country. In '77, she established the Mental Patient Rights Association in Florida. In '85, she has started the Berkeley Drop-In Center in Berkeley, California. She's been a pioneer in mental health advocacy. I've so admired her work for many years, fighting outpatient commitment so successfully, and really organizing folks in the community. In '83, she helped to co-found the California Network of Mental Health Clients, the first statewide consumer and advocacy organization in the nation. And she has served as executive director of that network from '97 to 2007. In '86, she wrote and edited Reaching Across, Mental Health Clients Helping Each Other, seminal book. And in '94, another part two, Maintaining Our Roots, Reaching Across, Maintaining Our Roots and Challenge of Growth. Currently, she's the executive director of the California Association of Mental Health Peer-Run Organizations, a statewide organization, provides advocacy, outreach, and training, California's consumer community. She remains committed to working for self-determination. And Joseph, I hope you talk about your self-directed care program, a real pioneering effort. And Sally's also with choice and empowerment of all people with mental health challenges. Celia Brown is a psychiatric survivor and longtime advocate for people with psychiatric disabilities. She's always amazed me because she works for state government, but she's also been the president of some of the most profound organizations in the country and finds a way to make that work. She's been the president of Mind Freedom International and a co-founder of a really timely, critically important group, a Facebook group called Surviving Race, the Intersection of Race, Disability, and Human Rights Coalition. I'll say that again. Surviving Race, the Intersection of Race, Disability, and Human Rights Coalition. She does work in the position of Regional Advocacy Specialist for the Bureau of Recipient Affairs, the New York City Field Office, New York State Office of Mental Health. She facilitates trainings on peer supervision, wellness and recovery approaches in community mental health agencies. She was one of the first peer specialists in New York and was instrumental in developing and implementing the peer specialist civil service title for the Office of Mental Health. She's a field school graduate of the Center to Study Recovery in Social Context, on the advisory committee of the Center for Practice Innovations, is a founder of the International Network Towards Alternatives and Recovery, has presented nationally and internationally on topics such as self-help, peer counseling, advocacy, trauma, and cultural competence. She's also been a major force from a policy and advocacy world. I've worked with her in her work with the National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery. So you can see how historic these pioneers are, how prolific they are. I'm just going to put my Zoom back on. Okay. How prolific, how dedicated they are, and how much of an impact. And I'm just so pleased that they're my friends. I'm just happy to be hanging out with this crowd, you know. So the question that we thought we would start with is, what is your first experience of whatever it is we deal with, whatever challenge, whatever name you want to use? And how did you experience that in your own life, and what was the reaction of people around you in the earliest years when you really began to have these experiences and these reactions? And let me start with Joseph, why don't we?
Hi, yes. I was officially diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at the age of 19. And was hospitalized actually several times, including hospitals in a public hospital, state hospital, and found my experience was that I had a hard time with reality, and it was the 70s, and I thought back then was an unreal time, and until we came up to 2002. And now we're finding out what unreality really is about. And it's didn't do well in school. Had a family that was had a lot of problems. Found myself very hard coping with late adolescence. Ended up hearing voices and really disconnected, and Didn't know what else to do. Went to a friend's house in panic and ended up in a hospital and spent over the next 10 years after that in and out of various hospitalizations, and had a really mixed experience. Some very bad experiences with the hospital. Ended up in 4-point restraint at one point. Always had great experiences though with the people who were the other inmates in the hospital. I found myself, I could connect with them, could find a lot of support with them. So that led me later in life to really think about the idea of what we now call peer support, what we called back then self-help, mutual support. So that's sort of my early experiences.
Okay, Celia, do you want to take a crack? Your early
Sure.
experience of any, how the
Well-
people around you, either in society, neighborhood, or family, reacted to you.
Well, at an early age, maybe, I was involuntarily committed in when I was 16, and this was back in the 80s. And I was struggling. I was having a hard time. My family really didn't understand what was going on with me, and really kind of thought, like, well, the hospital will help. Let's listen to the doctors, And I really never got myself really together until I got out, of course, got out of the psych hospital and connected with other people. And then I got introduced to the movement while I was living in a residential housing in the Bronx. And at that time, people weren't thought of as recovering. There wasn't that much housing because people were thinking that people should just live in the hospital for the rest of their lives. They shouldn't be in the community. So I stayed in the hospital for like a year because I didn't have housing. I got housing, and during that time, I was considered high functioning. So my counselor said, oh, there's this conference called Self-Help Vision in Troy, New York. Would you like to attend? I said, sure. So I went to the conference, and it changed my whole life. I met Joe Rogers. I think you were there. Judy Chamberlain at night. And I was blown away. And I said to Judy, who's allowing you to do this? They said, no one. We can make our own decisions. We can create our own alternatives and drop-in centers. And a light bulb went off, and it just really, really changed my life.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, but Sally, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, we've all had different experiences and somehow the same in terms of forced treatment and other people controlling our lives, when the best thing for us would have been us learning how to control our own lives and make our own decisions, our best pathway towards recovery. I was in a private hospital, and I was not young. I was not 16 or 17 or early 20s, as they say, the age that many people have mental distress. I was in my early 30s. But I had struggled most of my life. I just sort of managed to keep on going, getting through college. I had a whole different career. I was going to be a professor of English literature. Was living in New York. Over a period of time, I self-isolated, was daydreaming a lot, where my life was mostly daydreaming and not reality. And it's not as if one day I woke up and didn't know who I was, but basically there was suddenly a period of my time where I was totally disconnected with who I was. I was no longer Sally Zimmerman. That was not who I was. I didn't think people were after me to hurt me. I thought that they were somehow helping me. So in some ways, even my what they would call paranoia was people helping, not hurting. Probably because I'm a hopeful person, so I interpreted it as a positive thing. But I was totally detached from this person named Sally Zimmerman. I thought my family was nice people, but they weren't my family. I told them that, which was a mistake. And I was in a private hospital. It was in 1970 to 73. But, you know, hospitals are hospitals, and none of my experience was good. You know, I know friends from back then who were in horrendous, horrible state hospitals when they were given massive shock treatment and insulin treatment and seclusion and restraint. This doctor did not drug me. I did not have medications. I did not have shock treatment, which I now value, because I think I was always able to maintain my brain and be able to maintain the ability to work through this myself, because I wasn't over medicated or medicated at all. I was at one point put into literally a dungeon in a little old country house. A dungeon. It was the base. They had made a room out of a basement, in the basement, with a 2x4 for the key, and a little opening at the top of the room. I slept on a mattress on the floor. I was in my underwear. I was allowed to go up to the main bathroom to shower and use the toilet, etc., in the morning, with a male and female with me who was in the bathroom with me. And I was there for 3 months. It changed, you know, I was beaten by the doctor. I was sexually molested by the doctor. You know, this is almost 50 years ago, and you can feel that I'm upset talking about it now. So those things don't go away. But I have to say, I think this is startling to people that are not in our world, that probably that break with reality was the best thing that happened to me in my life. And I'm infinitely better on the other side. That, you know, recovery and resilience is not only possible, it happens all the time. And the life I've been able to create after the fact was much richer and than the life before. It's almost like I have a before and an after. And I'm old enough to look back at what are the big trends in my life. And that was a major one. And that changed the whole direction of my life and gave me meaning in my life and purpose and work. Of course, it was the movement, which I hope we will, you know, I want to talk about what I found when I found the movement in 1977. But as dreadful as my experiences were at the time, it was one of the pivotal things in my life, and I'm over 80 now.
Thank you, Sally. So much, all three of you, for your opening comments and your heart and your honesty. Just a quick left turn. I want to tell you we have people here from Oregon, North Carolina, California, Nevada, Colorado, New Jersey, Iowa, Maine, and I'm sure, and all over New York. So welcome again. It's very special event. So yeah, Sally, let's follow up with that question. Why don't you pick that up, which is
What I
your
found.
first experience. What's that?
What
How
I
you found the movement.
Yeah, how I found it.
And
I
how
loved
you found it, and
Go on.
what's that? I'm sorry.
I love Celia's story of her, the light went on, because I would love to talk about how my light went on when I found the movement. After this hospitalization, I settled on a farm, and really what rejuvenated me and what restored me and brought my health back was working on a farm. In nature, an organic vegetable farm, and exercising every day because it was farm work, and eating the vegetables I grew in the ground, and learning how to do my own water system and build a chicken pen and sew clothes and sort of there was no, I mean, I was not aware of any other kinds of any groups at that time, and so I couldn't rely on that. But I, by accident, well, for several years, I did a lot of soul searching as to, so what went on, what was all that about, and what happened, and it was so clear to me and clear to this day. I mean, my vision and my values have not changed to this day. The problem was really forced treatment. The problem was people controlling my life when what I needed was control over my life. But that control over my life would lead to, well, I mean, that self-determination to recovery and health. And I found the movement by accident, found that there were these groups sort of autonomous all around the country. This was in 1976, 77. Found out that there was this conference at the first conference I went to was in Los Angeles in Griffith Park. And I was so, I mean, I was still sort of unsteady and timid and scared. I mean, I wasn't the person that I am now. But I went clear across the country all by myself and took public transportation and somehow figured it out in LA and got to this park. And as you said, the light went on. It's like I found my other family. I mean, I found my family. They were my family. Remember when I went back to the farm, someone said, "Oh my God, you look like you're in love or you're getting married." And I was, and I did get married for the next, when was that, 44 years. What I found was, because it's so important for people to, that the world was different then. What the reality of the mental health, behavioral health system was so different. The hospitals were just closing. People had been in hospitals, as Celia said, you know, she was there for a whole year because that's what happened. You were in custodial care forever. Horrible rights violations and no civil rights. I mean, like people couldn't vote, they couldn't sign deeds, they couldn't, just basic civil rights. Commitment laws were just beginning to be limited, where they were getting more restrictive. So you've got this almost this perfect storm of the hospitals closing, civil commitment laws getting narrowed, and it was the 60s and early 70s, the civil rights movement, the liberation movement all around us. So we were getting out of hospitals and beginning to meet, you know, and independently outside of the hospital and validating each other and what happened without nurses standing over you. Or people observing you all the time. There were basic trends that when you trace from then to now have changed. So Celia sort of pinned it, was that the idea of once you were defined as mentally ill, it was for the rest of your life, and you'd have to take medication and be on medication the rest of your life. Recovery was not anything that people even conceived of. None of us had jobs. All of us that started organizing, if we did have jobs, it was certainly not in mental health. There was no such things as peer support. There were no such things as consumer-run programs. We used to sort of brainstorm them around campgrounds. And everything was about us without us, you know? I mean, it's like, it was just, that's what it was, is that nothing about us without us was not a viable thing. It didn't occur at that time. So what I found was a very, very political, militant movement. If everything is about you without you, and you're not in the room and you're not in the building and you're outside, what you are is with placards and doing civil disobedience and turning off electricity in hospitals so people can't get shock treatment, and you have to make yourself known. You have to make your voice clear. And that's what that movement was at the time. There were very autonomous groups around the country. We take no money from the mental health system, very, very pure. fairly anti-psychiatry because those were the people that had hurt us, that had taken control away from us and taken our rights away. The names of the groups are so different than today. Network Against Psychiatric Assault and Insane Liberation Front the organization that I'm the executive director of now is California Association of Mental Health Peer-Run Organizations. It's so mild compared to those days. But we were born out of the civil rights movement. I really believe our movement is a liberation movement. It was to start with, and maybe it's where it has to go now also. We educated each other because nobody had educated us about what the drugs and shock treatment could do. So we wrote our own pamphlets. We found out what our rights are. We had a conference, an international conference on human rights and against psychiatric oppression. That was people that was not paid for by anybody. If people got there, they hitchhiked and or paid their own way. It's a different world, but those are really the shoulders that we all stand on, those militant people that got together to make a difference. I am more and more convinced the older and older I get that advocacy really does make a difference, and I've seen it in the span of the 44 years I was involved. I think, I know that Joe and Celia have other really succinct things of what they found when they found the movement. Piece it all together and you might get a picture.
Oh, that was so profound and so well articulated. Thank you so much. I know people who are chatting are saying sending you all kinds of love and gratitude for that. Steve, do you want to talk about your first experience of the movement in more detail about who and where and how and what was it like?
Well, when like I said earlier, when I came back from Troy back to the Bronx, I was so energized that I created my own support group with members called Interexpressive Support Group, and just to really kind of figure out how we can support ourselves, because I always knew that there was something more than what I was experiencing. There was, but I couldn't see it, and I needed to be exposed to people who are actually, figuring out through self-determination and self-definition of who are they going to be in this world with the diagnosed with a mental illness. To me, I felt like I needed to be more than what I was told I was. So, I'm somebody's daughter, or sister, like, who am I? And it always bothered me because I wanted to be just me on my terms. And I found that it was okay to be different. I didn't have to be like, quote, normal like everybody else. I could be who I am and go through things and really have a new way of looking at myself and looking at the world. So that spurred me on to, get out of supported housing, which I'm grateful that I was able to get out of the hospital, be in housing, but to also go to college and also to, to find things on my own. And at that time when I was going to college, I didn't tell anybody that, I was diagnosed because, I think there was a lot of stigma around that time in the 90s. But what ultimately happened is I was asked to interview for a job as a peer specialist. It was a National Institute mental health grant, 5 grants, to work at Bronx Psychiatric Center, to work as members of the intensive case management team. And I had been a patient there. And so I was coming back there as a colleague. And I was so excited because I was thinking I was going to work with the professionals and everything was going to be great. I was going to be working with case managers. Come to find out that, you know, they weren't that happy about working with us, with me and the other peer specialists, and that would they have to treat us like clients? Like, what if we, you know, are not doing well, you know, would they have to intervene? So it was a learning curve. It was very difficult. It was groundbreaking, but hard. Um, but I'm glad that I went through that experience. But doing this, still very connected to the movement. I just want to honor Sally and Joe, because you guys, you know, I feel like I stand on your shoulders. And then Howie the Harp came to live in New York City, I believe in 1993 or 94, I'm not clear, but it was in the 90s. And I was just like, oh my God, I'm going to meet him. And I got to work with him. He created so much. He created the Howie the Harp. Now it's called the Howie the Harp. It's our name to him. And I just think he also just changed my life. I just used to watch Sally and Joe and Jude, Howie, and just really learn from them, as to me they were models as to what they were doing, and that helped me to become more of a somebody in the movement to help others. So it's really good to have people who are doing great things, you know, fighting for your rights, and really seeing that, being a part of that, I think is just so enlightening for me and for others.
Thank you so much, Celia. Joseph, now we're supposed to go to 1:15, but I don't care if we all want to hang around and we can. It's fine. We're also considering we may need a part 2 because there's so much to say and other ideas going forward. But Joseph, what was your experience of the movement? I have to say you're one of mine. And my very first was Ed Knight, and he introduced me to you. So I just want to say Ed Knight here because I think everybody here has had an experience, been touched by Ed, and just want to say his name. Joseph, do you want to take a crack at that one? Your first
Sure.
experience?
Yeah, I kind of grew up in between hospitalizations. I spent a lot of time involved. I didn't have a job. I couldn't get a job. So I spent most of my time organizing in the civil rights movement, the students' rights movement. I was very active with the farmers, Cesar Chavez, United Farm Workers in the boycott. Very active with the anti-war movement. So I was very familiar with the idea of civil rights and civil rights movement. But here I had this experience of having had abuse and serious problems, and definitely experiencing discrimination because of my experience as a mental patient, as we used to call ourselves, mental patients, because that was very descriptive of what we had been through. And or psychiatric inmate was another term. And I said to myself, basically, well, you know, I'm organizing around people's rights, and I was active with the ACLU, and they had a small project in New York City on the rights of mental patients, and they actually put out a book, a manual on the rights of mental patients. So I started to read and think about, well, how can we get organized? Maybe there could be an organization for people with who've been patients. Did some volunteer work with the Mental Health Association down in Central Florida, where I lived at the time. And through all of that, I ran across a couple things. There was a group called a group of radical therapists. They called themselves radical therapists, and they put out they had a collective, I think, out of Boston, and they put out a book on radical therapy, and I read that, and in there they talked about the fact that people who have what we now call a lived experience could get organized and should be organized. And through that, I found a newspaper called Madness Network News, which was put out of California. Sally eventually had a lot to do with that. You know, I read that, and this was wow. This was kind of put it all together for me. Later, I ended up in New Jersey, and was going to college and wanted to work in mental health, but I was having a hard time with college, and I was in a picket line with a teacher who said to me, "Well, you're a really lousy student," basically. And they were on strike. The teachers were on strike, and I was on a picket line in solidarity. And I said, "Yeah, I agree. What can I do about it?" And she said, "Well, you know, you could go out and, you know, you like organizing and you're a good organizer. You could organize and hire psychologists. You don't have to become a psychologist." So that kind of gave me an idea. So eventually I got hooked up with a group called the New Jersey Clearinghouse for Mental Health Self-Help Clearinghouse, and wrote a grant and got a grant from the state of New Jersey. And by that time I had read a book by Judy Chamberlain called On Our Own, and I thought, well, this would be great. Why don't we bring Judy into New Jersey, see if we had some money, and we could have a statewide conference, which would be a way of bringing people together to talk about how we could organize in New Jersey. And we brought Judy in, and we had a statewide conference, and we thought we'd have 20 or 30 people. We ended up with about a couple hundred people. And so that was one of the first mental patient organizing things I did. Later, Judy and several of us wanted to communicate and talk, so we started a national teleconference. I'm kind of going through this very quickly. All of this took, sometimes a lot of these would be a year between things, but we started a national teleconference. Judy was the moderator, and from the national teleconference, we got the idea, well, maybe we could, well, we found out, well, there was the International Conference on Human Rights and Against Psychiatric Oppression. I went to a couple of meetings of the human rights on psychiatric oppression. It didn't quite fit where I was at. I was more of a kind of wanting to reform things, not necessarily, I wasn't anti-psychiatry. I wanted to see there to be reform in the mental health system. I thought there would probably always be a mental health system, and we needed to do something to reform the mental health system. I guess I didn't believe we could abolish it. And but a group of us, both people that were involved in the teleconference, was a real variety of people, spectrum, very moderate people to what you might call very radical people. But we thought we could all get together in a unified conference, and the folks in Maryland and Baltimore, a group called On Our Own, based on Judy's book, were entity organizers, and we got a federal grant to organize the first alternatives conference based on Judy's book, The Alternatives to Mental Health. And that was one of the big gatherings that we got. We thought we'd get 50 people there, and I think we ended up with 500 people. So that's sort of some of the early days of my experience.
Thank you so much. Everybody's really reacting to these stories. we have less time than I'd like, so I want to just make a left turn completely unprepared. Celia, could you talk, I mean, the issue of racism, and its intersection with so many things, including the mental health, disproportionate number of African Americans in jails and prisons and on forced treatment. You're such a hero in that surviving race. I know we're talking about sitting down with Black Lives Matter in a couple of weeks. Could you I just don't want to miss that point. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, Surviving Race started in 2014, and this is when Eric Gardner was killed by the police, Michael Brown in Missouri, Ferguson. And I now am a mom, and I have a 24-year-old son, Kevin. And I was just so frustrated about what was happening and thinking about him, and this could happen to him. This could happen to any man of color or women of color anywhere. So one thing I do when there's things that are going on, I take it as an opportunity to organize. So I did a conference call with a couple of people that all of you know, and said, what can we do as a movement? What can we do? So at that time, we were in social media, like not before, you know. And they said, well, why don't we create a Facebook page and bring attention to this and focus on, police brutality, but also focus on people with disabilities, because again, family members do call 911 if their loved one is going through emotional distress or, acting strange, and they're calling really for help, and they don't get help. They get the police scared of them, who then that person is killed. So, so we have to deal with that. And it's important to understand that all lives matter, but Black lives matter. People with disabilities, people with psychiatric histories, their lives matter. And so we could bring all that together, all the issues that we're talking about here, bring up police brutality and bring the movement together, and let's educate ourselves about race. Let's be really clear on how we approach it and how it affects us in our lives, and how we can deal with systematic racism. So we've really grown to about over 900 members on Facebook page. We have people, white people, we have now this new term, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. We have allies, we have family members, we have mental health advocates, we have everyone. And so we accept everyone in this big tent. So we're not saying you have to think a certain way, you can't be in a group. That we can't do that anymore. We have to accept each other, and we can agree to disagree. But that's an important thing. I think what I see happening is we have to get out. I think Sally said this on our last planning call. We have to get out of our family a little bit, our mental health family, and get out there in the world and offer our support. These great supports that we've been creating. Joe's been creating with the National Mental Health Self-Help Clearinghouse. I've used many of your manuals in training and reaching across. So people don't know we exist when they think of something in the community, in the public. When they think of us, they say, oh, well, that person, are they in treatment? Are they taking meds? They don't know that people can recover. And I think that's a good story to tell people that might be struggling, that don't know where to go, to say, hey, wow, I recovered, or I'm in recovery. There's a whole movement out there. So they haven't been told the truth in the public. And the truth is we are in recovery. We've created so much, and also you, Harvey, over the years, but why isn't it out there? So, I mean, that's a whole issue, but I'm just saying, we need to be talking to our family members. It's just so simple as having a conversation. Maybe having a T-shirt, no forced treatment. Somebody comes up to you and say, hey, what does that mean? And then you have this conversation and you say, well, this is what it means. So it could be as just as simple as that, you know, or surviving race. Now we have T-shirts. I want to put a plug there. You know, what's surviving race? And then you're talking to, you know, your grocer, your neighbor, you know what I mean? And we don't think to go that way, but it starts with our own community, our neighbors, our family members. I'm always discussing this with my family and having these rich discussions with my mother, who's from the civil rights movement. And we discuss this all of the time, as if it happened yesterday for her. So I think all of us can do our part to let people know, you know, recovery is here, you know, self-help is here, you know, all these different words that we use now. It's here, and we should embrace it, and we should promote it. Thank you, Harvey.
Thank you.
I don't want to go over time.
Somebody is putting in, I think, the link to get to see his
Oh,
place. And
great.
so I
Thank you.
and Joseph, if they Google, would they get to any one of you, the Reaching Across manuals or your manuals, Joseph? Is there a link people can go to for each of you?
I'm putting it in
Sally,
right now.
Okay, great. And Sally, if you could do that too. So I just want to say a couple of things. We talked a little bit about crisis intervention. Something's happened in New York, maybe nationally. One of our leaders said, you know, we've tried sort of training the police. That hasn't really worked. There's a lot of issues around policing we're talking about everywhere. And so this new movement, and one of the chatters mentioned it, in New York City, we're talking about a new model of peers and emergency medical sort of technicians and no police. That's something we're thinking about as well. So I just want to make another point that you all mentioned back in the day, this movement was hatched in part with the inspiration of civil rights movement, African Americans, independent living centers, LGBTQI individuals, and it feels like we're coming full circle, saying now it's our turn to sort of navigate and intersect with those groups. It's almost like coming full circle. So I have a little controversial question. I don't know how controversial, but I do want to get it in. You know, some people have said the movement went two ways a couple of years ago. There's the pure advocates, and then there's the people who operate peer services. And they're not always the same. And to some degree, sometimes the peer service, the managers or the deliverers of the service are not really engaged in advocacy and not quite in that tradition. Not unsympathetic, but not focused on that. So I guess I want to focus on that. The disconnect, is there a disconnect between the peer provider, sometimes they even call it the peer provider industry. Is there a disconnect between peer agencies and peers who are focused on delivering the support and the business of peer support? Is there something lost there around the advocacy? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, Sally, you wanted to go? I'm sorry.
Well, you go and then I'll respond after you. That's fine.
Okay. I think historically there's been people who are more interested in doing self-help and mutual support or peer support. And then there's been people that are really see themselves as activists, sometimes radical activists and sometimes more moderate activists, but they see themselves as doing organizing and activism. And it's been hard to see the combination of both. Judy talked about it in her book On Her Own. On her own, she documented what we would call peer-run programs. Back then they were called self-help programs or patient-run, client-run programs. And most of those programs were limited, and that she documented in her book were limited. One of the few programs that did both was Howie the Harp's program in New York, which was, I'm blanking on the name, Sally. What's the name of Howie's program was?
Howie,
in New York?
New York or California? New York?
In New York.
The Howie the
Howie
Harp?
the Harp advocacy.
No, there was a
Oh,
how he went back to,
Project
he
Release.
started in New York.
Project Release.
Release.
Yeah.
Project Release was
Way
both
back,
a mutual
way back.
help and an
Yeah.
advocacy program. So that,
Got it.
so just to answer your question, Harvey, I think there is a disconnect in a way, but it's kind of a historical disconnect.
I want
Um,
to make a left turn again. Sally, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think they're two arms of the same thing. I mean, advocacy and peer and support are, I've gone back and forth throughout those 40 years where I ran a consumer run drop-in center and was direct services, and now I'm more involved in advocacy and legislation and policy on a state level. I think they have to, they're two arms of the same body. I am concerned, of course, I remember the days of sitting around campground and literally brainstorming what it would be like if we had our own programs. There were no such things as consumer run programs or formalized peer support. So those are wonderful, wonderful achievements we've gotten through our advocacy led to them. But I am concerned that as we become peer supporters and part of the system, we become like the very system that we are there to be change agents. I think it all, though, I really, in my heart, believe that we are a liberation movement. And Cecilia was pointing to is I think that maybe now, and maybe we swing back and forth between services and advocacy in sort of the decades or particular states and where they're at that particular time. They do go back and forth between concentrating on one or the other. But it might be now is the time that we really go back to advocacy and our liberation base. I have been, especially with the movements now and the civil unrest and this civil rights movement sort of coming to light, on the streets again, that our mental health movement has to move outside of itself and not be so separated and insular. I know our organization, CAMFRO, has recently expanded its principles, its public policy principles to talk about social justice and community health, which is a much bigger, wider thing than just mental health, which means that in the future, when we look at bills that are coming out of the state legislature, we just don't look at the little tag that says mental health anymore. We look at the tag that says racism and talks about poverty, it talks about housing. Our movement's always talked about meeting people where they're at, and that mental distress was real reactions to real situations of poor housing and poverty and being marginalized. So in some ways, we've always talked about holistic services, but now it may be the time to sort of re-enter the world more and be part of this worldwide liberation movement. Expand our horizons, which is sort of going back to the beginning, which when we really were a liberation movement.
Beautiful sound. Sometimes I'm looking at one of the questions, but before I do that, I have to say one thing. People have criticized the movement for being too white and too male. Can you say, Celia and Sally, a few words about that? Just a few, because we're going to run out of time.
Do you want me to say something, Harvey?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Here's what I think. Our history and our movement cannot be erased. It happened, and it did start out with, white middle-class people, and I have to say that the people on this webinar helped save my life. Okay, that's one. I think the intersections now are important, and that we have to embrace people of color and the LGBTQIA community, and we have to work together in figuring out how do we come together. And we have to have these difficult, critical discussions It's not simple, and help people become aware and feel safe in these spaces, and also create the spaces that you want to talk about. But it's not simple. So we can't sit and say, let's erase all of it that's happened. Let's erase Sally and Joe and, Howard and Harp, because they were important figures in our movement and brought us where we are today. And it's just like, like slavery or the Holocaust. I didn't like it, but it happened, and history isn't always great, but there are opportunities for us to learn and to expand. And so the history, to me, that everybody should know the history of our movement. I think everyone should know about it. And then you can figure out, how do I move from that point? What is it there in the movement that I can take with me into the present, into the future? And I think that's what we need to do.
Sally, can you spend a few minutes on women?
Harvey?
Yeah, you want to spend a few minutes on women? Do you think can you hear me okay? No? Yeah. Okay. Just a few minutes on women. We're just talking about, does the movement sufficiently embrace women? Has it been too dominated by white men? Just a couple of minutes, because I do have a couple more questions too.
I think the world has been too dominated by white men. That's we of course had Judy Chamberlain, who was a great heroine and maybe the mother of the movements, and who was a woman. But and in those old days, there was a strong women against psychiatric assault that talked a lot about women's issues. So I don't know that our movement is any different than any other in the world, that it's been dominated by men.
Thank you. I want to just say that there are questions here that I hope we can answer in succeeding sort of webinars. One of them is peer services. How do you keep it about liberation? How do you recognize that it is, once it's reimbursed, there are requirements, but can we make it about liberation? I think we can. I think there's a nexus, and I think it has a lot to do with the director of the peer program contracting in the correct way, and not contracting for the wrong outcomes. But anyway, just a thought. And also maybe a future webinar and just on advocacy itself. But let me ask about that. And I don't want to sort of do on a negative, but what could we as a movement, we fight each other. We get into spats. This one goes online and takes threads and threads about things, but it doesn't lead to action. And people criticize
Harvey, that's kind of old history. I don't think that's happening as much anymore.
Okay.
You're going back like 20 years on some of this stuff,
I hope so.
Which is history, and we need to explore it. But to explore that would take another 2-hour program, because it's not a simple matter.
Okay.
I think we like every movement, and there's real diversity. People have different opinions, and sometimes they don't express those opinions in the nicest way. So, but I think more currently we're seeing a lot more unity. I think things that places where we can have the dialogue, like Facebook, has really helped. Not that I want to give any more money to Zucker, but but they have helped us have that dialogue.
Okay. Thank you, Joseph. That's a very good point. I guess we only have a few minutes, so I'm wondering if we could talk about next steps. We talked a lot about the past. We raised a couple of issues of the present. What's your hope for the movement? What do you think what's the most important thing we can strive for? I just want to say a shout out for the words "recovery is expected." It's not that it happens; it's to be expected for everybody. But anyway, back to this. What's your hopes for the future for the movement? Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So, Sally, you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I just want people to appreciate also how, as I said, advocacy really does make a difference in where we have come from and what we have achieved so far. You can see that when you sort of, it's almost like as you age, like flying over a landscape and see what it was then and what it is now, from this custodial um, culture to recovery culture, from everything being about us without us to nothing about us without us, to us having jobs, which, as you say, has led to compromises and co-optation, but nevertheless, we now have jobs in the field that we are passionate about. So we have achieved a lot. For me, because it's something I'm centered in right now, is the next steps is to expand our horizon and expand our comfort zone, and almost like re-entering the world where in California we have specialty mental health. It's carved out. It's come back, put ourselves back with the rest of the world, um, and see our social justice movement as part of the social justice movements in the world of for ethnic and cultural populations, and um, just generally is a anti-discrimination, anti-bigotry movement, and we are part of it. And I don't know when we will have our breakthrough. We have not had our breakout, and our breakthrough, as Harvey, you often talk about, is when we will be able to march in the streets and people will talk about mental health in a more progressive way, and uh, that the antidote to hospitals, I'm sorry, the antidote to jails and homelessness isn't more forced treatment, which is where people are right now. But I see that one day. I mean, I may not see it, but that it will happen one day where people with lived experience will be marching as equals with everybody else.
I just want to say about that phrase, we've been saying for a while now, civil rights folks had Selma, women had Seneca Falls, and LGBTQI individuals had Stonewall. Haven't had that moment. And it better begin with an S, that's all I got to say. So let's see. What about you, Joseph, in terms of the future? What's your highest and best hope for what we can do sort of going forward?
Well, I agree with Sally. I think that we some of our best times are yet to be had. But I think we've created a base, getting people active, whether they're active being a peer supporter or active as an writing letters, active in the streets. That's what we need to do. And I think as we see greater activism in the culture, that encourages greater activism within the concept of what we're about. If you look at the changes that have taken place, even in our lifetime, it's amazing. And I think we can see basically even greater ability for people to take more control of their life. And there's a lot we can learn from other cultures. So I just think we're beginning. I look to the young people. I'm sort of retired, so I'm looking to those young people out there to start getting active and making their voices heard.
Well, following your steps, Joseph. Yes.
I just wanted to chime in. I agree with Joe and Sally. I think advocacy is coming back. I do think that, we have to kind of work together with all the different intersections now, all the different people who are now coming into our movement, like people with disabilities, people in the prison. We have to partner with these different organizations, not just us. Got to get out of our family and out there in the world. And two, I think we need to do mentoring. And that's something that I do regularly, just in a conversation, mentoring people, like letting people know what's happened in the movement, helping support people figuring out things, and giving resources and things like that, you know. And I like to talk about the movement or mention Joe Rogers or mention Sally and, oh, here's a video, go to the website. You know, a lot of people don't even know the movement exists, and the younger people are coming in again with their own ideas, and they're doing great activism, I have to say. I give it up to them, but they also sometimes need mentorship, mentoring and supporting them and their quest. I felt like I was mentored in the movement, and I feel like that might be something that we could do.
So I'm just going to end maybe with hopefully not a negative, but for those of us watching the last few years, in this country, we've been going backwards in a number of ways. And in the mental health world, there are forces that have had their way with us a little bit in the last few years. More forced treatment, more using Medicaid to pay for state hospitals, the IMD exclusion, lesser privacy rights, questions around protection and advocacy. These were ones we all dealt with just a few years ago. Murphy legislation, SAMHSA seems to go there. No looking at evidence for.
Yeah, but look what happened to Murphy.
I know.
They ran Murphy off the hill. Goodbye, Murphy.
Thank you. Thanks. But I would just say, you know, we have to come together. There is a political winds that have come backwards, and maybe starting with outpatient commitment. A number of us have worked on that for years. We have data, Sally and I, Joe's, all of us. And so we have research to counter the crap that is spread, to advance it. So, you know, I'd like to put a plug in for working together against forced outpatient treatment, and I'd be happy to be contacted by you all to make the case and to figure out the alternatives. And I'll talk more about that if we get a chance, maybe in future webinar. So I want to thank our speakers. We had so much. You really packed it in there, and you really inspired so many people, including me. So we'll come back. We'll do other webinars, hopefully with you all, because people could hear from me for the longest time. And the themes that have been brought up today need so much more attention. So thank everybody who came. We have people from.
Thank you, Harvey. Yeah. Thanks for putting this together.
Yeah.
Thank you, Harvey.
Welcome.
And, you know, in terms of unifying and getting together and advocating for the future, Joe and I have had our tips in the past, and both, I guess and I don't want to speak for him, but I assume him too, have learned that there's a bigger picture and higher values than this sort of infighting that can destroy any kind of movement. So, I mean, both of us, I know I look forward to that in the future and now.
Well, I want to end with Celia Brown's. Always love the way she speaks. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about it some other time. My Bronx accent.
Yeah.
Not very well done. Okay. Thank you for coming, everybody. God bless.
Thank you, Harvey. Thank you, everyone. Hugs for everyone.
Same here. We're a big tent. Let's keep at it. We'll see you on the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye.